In 1949, the smoke jumpers were not far from their origins, as parachute jumpers turned stunt performers, dropping from the wings of planes at county fairs and just for the hell of it, plus a few dollars, less hospital expenses. By this time, they were also sure they were the best firefighters in the United States Forest Service, and although by now they were very good, especially against certain kinds of fires, they should have stopped to realize that they were newcomers in this ancient business of fighting forest fires. It was 1940 when the first parachute jump on a forest fire was made, and a year later that the smoke jumpers were organized, so only for 9 years had there been a profession with the aim of taking on, at the same time, three of the four elements of the universe: air, earth, and fire. And in a simple continuous act, dropping out of the sky and landing in a treetop or on the face of a cliff in order to make good their boast of digging a trench around every fire they landed on by 10 o'clock the next morning. In 1949, the smoke jumpers were still so young that they referred affectionately to all fires they jumped on as 10 o'clock fires, as if they already had them under control before they jumped. They were still so young they hadn't learned to count the odds and to sense they might owe the universe a tragedy. It is true, though, that no technical advance was to influence the Forest Service's method of spotting and fighting wildfires uh, as much as the airplane, which arrived early in the century about the same time as the Forest Service, 1905. Two world wars hastened the union between airplanes and firefighting. By 1917, Chief Forester Henry S. Graves was conferring with the Chief of the Army Air Corps about the possibility of Army planes flying patrol missions over western forests. By 1925, the Forest Service itself started using planes from which fires could be spotted more quickly and thoroughly than from scattered lookouts. By 1929, planes were dropping supplies to firefighters, and it seemed that soon firefighters themselves would be dropped. But psychological difficulties and difficulties with equipment held back the development of parachute jumping on wildfires. It was only after several years of experimenting and training that the first parachute jump on a forest fire was made, one of the two jumpers being Earl Cooley, who was to be the spotter on the C-47 that carried the smoke jumpers to the Man Gulch fire, and as spotter tapped each jumper on the left calf as a signal to step into the sky over Man Gulch. The chief psychological roadblock holding up the acceptance of parachute jumping by the government and the public itself was the belief that most parachute jumpers were at least a little bit nuts, and the high probability that a few of them were. In 1935, Evan Kelly of the Forest Service Region 1, with headquarters in Missoula, Montana, where in a few years one of the biggest smoke jumper bases was to be established, rejected the possibility of dropping men on fires from parachutes by saying, "The best information I can get from experienced flyers is that all parachute jumpers are more or less crazy, just a little bit unbalanced. Otherwise, they wouldn't be engaged in such a hazardous undertaking." There is no doubt that among those most visibly touched with the Icarus complex were jumpers off wings of planes at county fairs or stuntmen doing the same kind of work for movies. Only a year before Kelly had made his psychological analysis of parachute jumpers, Frank Derry, a stuntman in California, and short of cash, got the idea of jumping from a plane in a parachute dressed as Santa Claus. He made a perfect landing, pleased the local Los Angeles merchants, quit factory work for good, joined a flying circus, barnstorming the West, and became one of the 9 original Forest Service smoke jumpers, one of the Forest Service's finest jump instructors, and one of its biggest riggers, making important improvements in both the parachute and the jumpsuit. Most people have a touch of the Icarus complex and, like smoke jumpers, wish to appear on Earth from the sky. In my hometown of Missoula, Montana, older brothers all over town train their younger brothers to jump from garage roofs using gunny sacks for parachutes. The older brothers argued that the younger brothers should do the jumping because, being smaller, they would take longer to reach the ground and so give their gunny sacks more time to open and soften the landing. From the start, smoke jumpers had to have a lot of what we have a little of. One way all men are born equal is in being born at least a little bit crazy, some being more equal than others. A number of these latter were needed to get the smoke jumper started. and a certain number more have always been needed to keep it going. Fortunately, many of those powered by the Keras complex, like a Keras, are gifted mechanically in odd ways and have long worked on problems connected with landing safely. Even the most sublime of oddballs, Leonardo da Vinci, had studied the problem of safely landing men on Earth from the sky. But it wasn't until 1783 that the French physicist Louis Sebastien Lenormand made the first successful parachute jump from a tower, and even in 1930 the parachute had many shortcomings as a means of aerial transport, some of which were eliminated or reduced by none other than Frank Derry, the Santa Claus parachute jumper, who's also gifted mechanically. One of the parachute's greatest shortcomings as aerial transport had been that, being a parabolic object, it drops with a bell-like motion. As it descends, air is forced up into it, and since there are no openings in the parachute through which the air can escape, it rocks up on one side until the surplus air is released, then swings to the other side till it tips out the excess air it has accumulated on its return trip. As a result, before the parachute could be a reasonably safe means of getting from the sky to the earth, the rocking had to be taken out of its flight, and some means of steering it had to be devised, so smoke jumpers and their supplies could be dropped on a designated spot near a fire instead of scattered all over the nearby mountains. The parachute developed by Frank Derry became the standard smoke jumper's parachute for many years, and is the parachute used by the crew that dropped on the Man Gulch fire. The rocking motion had been reduced by 3 openings through which air could be released, an opening on top and 2 slots on opposite sides. On the outside of the chute attached to the slots were tails, pieces of nylon that acted as rudders to guide the flow of air coming through the slots, and to them guidelines were attached so that the direction of the flight was ultimately determined by the jumper. Not a highly safe and sensitive piece of machinery, but better than a Keras had. It had a speed of 7 or 8 knots, and as soon as the jumper could, he turned his face to the wind and looked over his shoulder to see, among other things, that he didn't smash into a cliff. Frank Derry, his 2 brothers, and others of the early smoke jumpers not only greatly improved the parachute, but soon were developing a safer jumpsuit, one designed especially for jumping in mountainous timber country. Football helmet with heavy wire mesh face mask, felt-lined suit, and shock absorbers such as ankle braces, athletic supporters, back and abdominal braces, and heavy logger boots, the white logger boots of Spokane, Washington, the best. Frank Derry's 2 brothers were helpful, but staying put was not part of their calling, and they weren't long with the smoke jumpers. Frank, however, lasted much longer, then bought a bar nearby and became his own best customer. So far, it has all been the jump and smoke jumping and nothing about the smoke or fire at the end. In 1949, a fair number of old-timers in the Forest Service still believe that God means there only to be one honest way to get to a forest fire, and that is to walk your guts out. To these old-timers, the smoke jumpers were from a circus sideshow, although in fact, they were already on their way to becoming the best firefighting outfit in the Forest Service. Basic movements in the history of the Forest Service had helped put the smoke jumpers by 1949 on their way to being the best. The United States Forest Service was officially established in 1905 by President Theodore Roosevelt and Governor Gifford Pinchot of Pennsylvania, Eastern outdoorsmen who knew and loved the earth and its wondrous ways when left to itself and given a chance. Their policy of acquiring and protecting some of the earth's most beautiful remaining parts became the Forest Service's primary purpose. Then came 1910, the most disastrous fire on record. In western Montana and Idaho, 3 million acres were left as charred trees and ashes that rose when you walked, but then blew away when you passed. This transformation occurred largely in two days, August 20th and 21st, when thousands of people thought the world was coming to an end, and for 87 people it did. I remember those 2 days very well. My family was on summer vacation, camped in tents on an island between forks of the Bitterroot River. The elders in my father's church had become alarmed and had come in a wagon to rescue us. A team of the elders waded out to our island, crossed hands, and in this cradle carried my mother back to the wagon. My father and I followed, my father holding me with one hand and his fishing rod with the other, and I also holding my fishing rod with my other hand. It was frightening, as what seemed to be great flakes of white snow were swirling to the ground in the heat and darkness of high noon. I was 7 years old and might have cried for our tent, which we had to leave behind, except I thought my mother and our 2 rods would make it to the wagon. Since 1910, much of the history of the Forest Service can be translated into a successful effort to get firefighters on fires as soon as possible. The sooner, the smaller the fire. If a campfire left burning can be caught soon enough, a man with a shovel can bury it. If a fire is a lightning fire burning in a dead tree, a man will need an axe to drop the burning tree and will still need the shovel to dig the shallow trench into which he's going to drop and bury it. If 2 smoke jumpers had reached the Man Gulch fire the afternoon it started, they would at least have kept it under control until a larger crew arrived. Before the Man Gulch fire was finally put under control 5 days later, there were 450 men on it, and they didn't have as much to do with stopping it as did cliffs and rock slides. So history went from trails and walking and pack mules to roads and trucks up every gulch to 4-wheel drives where there weren't any roads to planes and now to helicopters, which can go about anywhere and do anything when they get there or on the way. The smoke jumpers are a large part of this history. Graphs prove it. The 2 graphs reproduced in this chapter are a part of statistical studies by Charles F. P. Kern, fire coordinator of the Forest Service Region 1, and Assistant Fire Coordinator Ronald Hendrickson of the variations in number and size of forest fires in Region 1 from 1930 to 1975. The first graph, total number of fires per acre, shows just what an old-time woodsman who has long fought fires would expect, that there's been no significant trend either up or down in the number of wildfires during those 45 years. There's been a bad fire year now and then, as in the late 30s and early 60s, and there probably always will be now and then. Let's hope never as bad as 1910. But on a statistical curve, lightning seems to be a fairly fixed feature of the universe, as does the number of people who are careless with campfires. The result is no discernible downtrend in the number of wildfires. The graph entitled Number of Fires Rated Class C and Larger tells a very different story and shows clearly the coming and continuing presence of the smoke jumpers. The number of fires rated Class C, that's 10 to 99 acres, and larger in Region 1, figured as a percentage of the total fires per year, plunged sharply as the smoke jumpers became an organization in the early 1940s, then made its last sharp rise to almost 9% with the coming of World War II, when the smoke jumpers became a depleted operation, but plunged just as precipitously when the war was over and veterans filled up the crews of smoke jumpers who again were stopping fires before they spread far. Since 1945, there's been no year when 5% of the fires became Class C or larger. 30 years is surely a trend, no doubt one that cannot be ascribed solely to the smoke jumpers, but one that has to be a great tribute to them. Although this trend has to be attributed in part to the fixed theory of doing everything possible between heaven and earth to get firefighters on a fire as fast as possible, what also makes a world of difference is the kind of men who get there first. The requirements used in selecting the first crews of smoke jumpers give a rough profile of the kind of men the Forest Service thought were needed to join Sky with Fire, and these same requirements should have given the jumpers some idea of their life expectancy. They had to be between 21 and 25, in perfect health, not married, and holding no job in the Forest Service as important as a ranger. So basically they had to be young, tough, and in one way or another from the backcountry, and the Forest Service carried no insurance on them. It is not hard to imagine why the smoke jumpers from the start have had several visible bloodlines. With their 2 major activities, to jump from the sky and fight fire when they land, they have always drawn professional adventurers. The 3 Dairy brothers are good examples. They were important in giving shape and substance to the early history of the smoke jumpers, and from the nature of things, the smoke jumpers will probably always draw their quota of adventurers. On weekdays, they are likely to rent a Cessna 180 and go jumping just for the hell of it. They try to make big money in the summer, and some go to Honolulu and shack up for the winter at night, passing themselves off as natives to multinational female tourists, or even to female natives. Others spend the winters as ski instructors in Colorado or Utah or Montana. Cold to work in the day, but probably not at night. One might assume that most smoke jumpers come from the woods, and after they are finished as jumpers, join up for the good of the United States Forest Service or some state agency supervising public lands, or some private logging company. The smoke jumper base in Missoula is a magnet for tough young guys pointed toward the woods for life. Besides being the headquarters for Region 1 of the Forest Service, Missoula is also the home of the University of Montana, which has a powerful school of forestry. Any summer, a highly select number of forestry school students are smoke jumpers. Of the 13 firefighters who died in Man Gulch, 5 were forestry students at the University of Montana, and 2 were forestry students at the University of Minnesota. 2 of the 3 survivors had just finished high school and were also University of Montana students. Select, very good students trained in the woods. At best, though, there is very little chance of a long-time future in smoke jumping. To start with, you are through jumping at 40, and for those who think of lasting that long, there are only a few openings ahead, administrative or maintenance. But one thing that remains with smoke jumpers, no matter where they ultimately land, is a sense of being highly select for life, and of belonging for life to a highly select outfit, somewhat like the Marines, who know what they are talking about when they speak of themselves as the proud and the few. Although many smoke jumpers never see each other after they leave the outfit, they remain members of a kind of fraternal organization that also has some dim ties seemingly with religion. Thus, being a first-class woodsman admits you to almost anywhere in an international fraternity of sorts. Although you will meet only a few of your worldwide brotherhood, you will recognize any one of them when you see them swing an axe. Going a little up the fraternal ladder is being admitted to the Forest Service, and that is like belonging to the Masons or the Knights of Columbus. Making the next step is becoming a smoke jumper, and that is like being a Shriner or a Knight Templar. This kind of talk is going too far, but not altogether in the wrong direction. It's very important to a lot of people to make unmistakably clear to themselves and to the universe that they love the universe, but are not intimidated by it and will not be shaken by it, no matter what it has in store. Moreover, they demand something from themselves early in life that can be taken ever after as a demonstration of this abiding feeling. So it shouldn't be surprising that many smoke jumpers never intend to remain smoke jumpers or even to work in the woods for the rest of their lives. A good number of them are students working for MAs or PhDs. Even more go on to be lawyers and doctors, and even more to be dentists. These young men are first class, both as students and jumpers. They tend to hang out together but don't talk much about their university life, at least not when other jumpers are around. Later, though, when they are far away and far up the professional ladder, they get a remote look in their eyes when they talk about the tap on the calf of the left leg, telling them it's only a step to the sky. For many former smoke jumpers, then, smoke jumping is not closely tied up with their way of life, but is more something that is necessary for them to pass through and not around, and once it is unmistakably done, does not have to be done again. The it is within, and is the need to settle some things with the universe and ourselves before taking on the business of the world, which isn't all that special or hard, but takes time. This is it. This it is something special within that demands we do something special, and it could be within a lot of us. On the bottom line is the story of an outfit, as men call themselves when they take on the same tough job. Have to be thought a little bit crazy to try it, have to stick together and share the same training to get it done, and shortly afterwards have to go to town together and stick together if one of them starts losing a fight in a bar. They back each other and they imitate each other. It should be clear that this tragedy is not a classical tragedy of a monumental individual crossing the sword of his will with the sword of his destiny. It is a tragedy of a crew Its flaws and grandeur is largely those of smoke jumpers near the beginning of their history. Their collective character counts, and being young counts. It especially counts, but only certain individuals emerge out of the smoke and roar that took in everything. Eldon Dietert counts. He was a fine research student who was called from his birthday dinner to make this flight and told some of the crews that he almost said no. Only recently a scholarship in the forestry school at the University of Montana has been named in his honor. David Navone was already something of a four-dimensional adventurer. He'd been a first lieutenant in the 101st Airborne Division and had parachuted into Bastogne, and in about an hour would be taking snapshots on his way to death. William Hellman, squad leader and second in command, was handsome and important, and only a month before had made a parachute landing on the ellipse between the White House and the Washington Monument. At the end, he wished he had been a better Catholic, and men wept when they saw him still alive. Then there were three survivors: R. Wagner, Wag Dodge, the foreman, gifted with his hands, silent on principle, and fastidious, who invented a fire and lay down in its ashes, lived only a few years more. Walter Rumsey and Robert Sallee, the other two who survived, spent years trying to forget the fire. Part of our story will be to find them and to bring them back to Man Gulch with us to discover how well they remembered and forgot. In this part of the story, there are living ghosts as characters, and the story doesn't come out quite the way either the ghosts or the non-ghosts expected. But even in the memories of those who knew them, the dead smoke jumpers have a collective character. When you ask any one of them what he knew of any one of the dead, you always get the same answer, which is undoubtedly true. He was a great guy, and when parents can bring themselves to speak of his son, they always say, he was a wonderful boy. Of the 15 who jumped on the fire, 13 were between 17 and 23, and were still so young they didn't like the taste of hard liquor but drank beer, gallons of beer. Being that young, they were in good part what their training made them, and maybe with their girls, maybe especially with their girls, they acted mostly like smoke jumpers. Important in becoming a smoke jumper is learning how to act like one. First-year smoke jumpers believed women were largely what second or third-year smoke jumpers told them women were, and having few chances to see women of the world while they were on the job in the woods, they had a very small body of fact to correct what they were told. Probably the woman of the world they knew best was at the nearest bar, about a 4.5-mile walk down the road from their training base at 9 Mile. And sometimes, especially after returning from a jump, they wouldn't get to the bar until nearly 1:30 at night, which was closing time, but they would make the owner stay open until dawn, no matter the time. There was always this same tall dame on a stool waiting to accommodate herself to their beer. She was tall and silent, but after a couple of hours her trunk would begin to sway, and as she finally toppled like a tree from her stool, the smoke jumpers would all stand and yell, "Timber." Then they would walk 4.5 miles back to the base and be ready to jump. The few such glimpses of women, when mixed with verbal images of them drawn by experienced jumpers, must have left first-year jumpers picturing women of the world as part tree, probably part sheep, and certainly part deer, because almost without a doubt they had branches and antlers. What most first-year jumpers really knew about women was only one girl, the girl back home. She had been a junior in high school when he had been a senior. He took time off in the summer to be with her at the creamery picnic back home. He took at least another weekend off during the summer just to be with her. Then they went on a long packing trip together. She always carried at least 40 pounds in her pack sack, and they would stay out overnight. Like him and the other great walkers, she walked slightly stoop-shouldered. At night, after he returned to his job of smoke jumping, he would float into their dreams from the sky looking for a fire. And as he floated by, always he stopped for a look at her. If he had to go on before he found her, she would wake up deeply disturbed, but believe it or not, she never thought of him as tough. It is hard to realize that these young men would be dead within 2 hours after they landed from parachutes no longer made of silk but of nylon, so they would not be eaten by grasshoppers. So it was a young outfit, of necessity young as individuals, and barely started as an organization. As individuals, they would soon go the way of prize fighters, all washed up when their reflexes began to slow by fractions of a second and when they no longer could absorb the beating and come back to win. Few have ever made it to the age limit of 40. As an organization, the outfit also was young, only 9 years old in 1949, and some of those 9 years were war years, when the development of the smoke jumpers was slowed down. The war, though, had positive after effects on the history of smoke jumpers. For instance, of the 15 who jumped on the Man Gulch fire, 12 had been in the armed services, and the other 3 had been too young to enlist. In 1949, then, this was an outfit of great power, and to us, but not to them, of some apparent weaknesses. Although modern graphs demonstrate the effectiveness of smoke jumpers in carrying out their major purpose of putting out fires so fast they don't have time to become big ones, nothing initially, at least not before the Man Gulch fire, made visible any weaknesses in adhering too exclusively to this purpose, even when it would have made sense to enlarge it. One danger of making almost a sole specialty of dropping on fires as soon as possible is that nearly all such fires will be small fires, and a tragic corollary is that not much about fighting fires can be learned by fighting small ones. Small fires, remember, most frequently are put out with a shovel and an axe, to which, for the sake of the record, a Pulaski should be added. A Pulaski being a double-bitted axe with one of the bits made into a little hole. As for big fires in the early history of the Forest Service, a young ranger made himself famous by answering the big question on the exam. What would you do to control a crown fire? With one liner, get out of the way and pray like hell for rain. Another weakness that might show up from a specialization of dropping on small fires in otherwise inaccessible country is that there aren't enough of them in a usual season to make them into a profession. In 1949, when there were big critical fires that could be approached on the ground, the Forest Service continued its original practice, as it was to do with the Man Gulch fire, of going to the big towns, Spokane, Butte, Missoula, or Helena, picking up what they could find, sitting at bars or lined up outside employment agencies, maybe with one good pair of walking shoes among the whole bunch, which one barfly passed to the other in the alley when it came his turn to be interviewed. In these early times, when smoke jumpers were not actually on fires, most of which were small, they were either at their base picking dandelions out of the lawn while waiting for their names to come up to the head of the jump list, or out in the woods on what were called projects, building trail, stringing telephone wire, thinning dense timber, not learning much of anything about what to do when a fire gets big enough to jump from one side of a canyon to the other. The smoke jumpers are now the crack firefighters of the Forest Service, the shock troops. Whenever fires are critical, which practically always means big, that's where they are, from Missoula, Montana to Minnesota to New Mexico to Alaska, and they don't care how they get there, by plane, bus, horse, or on foot, just so it's the fastest way. They're the professional firefighters for a living, taking on fires of all sizes and shapes. A Class C fire, 10 to 99 acres, has a special place in this story, although as forest fires go, it is no great fire. But many of this crew had never been on a fire as big as a Class C fire. Wag Dodge, the foreman of the crew and a smoke jumper foreman since 1945, had led one crew of smoke jumpers to one Class C fire in 1948 and to one Class D fire, 100 to 299 acres, the year before, but to no fire larger than that. When the crew landed on the Man Gulch fire, it was a C. Then suddenly it blew, and probably no one there had ever been on a blow-up before. A blow-up to a forest fire is something like a hurricane to an ocean storm. When 450 men finally got the Man Gulch fire under control, it had burned 4,500 acres, between 7 and 8 square miles. The primary purpose of the first smoke jumpers then was still primary to the smoke jumpers in 1949. To land on a forest fire in difficult or otherwise inaccessible country before suddenly the universe tried to reduce its own frame of things to ashes and charred grouse. When the Man Gulch fire was first spotted from the plane, the pilot, the crew, the foreman, and the spotter sized it up as a fairly ordinary fire. They reported it was just a ground fire that had crowned in one place where it had already burned out. None of the three saw any spot fires around its edges, and that meant the fire had been advancing slowly on the ground I was not playing leapfrog by throwing small fires ahead of the fire's main front. The words in quotation marks above, and undoubtedly some that are not, are those of firefighters, and we had better be sure of the meaning of these key words. The basic English of firefighters, so that when the tragic race between the firefighters and the fire begins, it won't have to be stopped for definitions. It is not enough to know the word for this or that kind of fire. To know one fire is to see how what was dropping live ashes from a dead tree at the end of one afternoon by the next afternoon had become one kind of fire after another kind of fire, until it had become a monster. Until it had become a monster. After another kind of fire, until it had become a monster in flames from which there was no escape. Of the two main kinds of forest fires distinguished by their causes, man and nature itself, the Man Gulch fire was a lightning fire, as 75% of the forest fires in the West are. Lightning fires usually start when lightning gets its first chance to strike, high up near the top of a ridge but slightly down its side, where the first clump of dead trees stands, and the start of the Man Gulch fire fits this description. The fire in the dead snag may drop live ashes for several days before starting a fire on the ground, for the ground near a mountaintop is likely to be mostly rocky, with at best only a light covering of dead leaves, needles, and grass. But the lightning storm that started the Man Gulch fire passed over the gulch on August 4th, and by the end of the next afternoon, on the hottest day ever recorded in nearby Helena, 13 smoke jumpers were dead. Once started on the ground, the lightning fire became simply a ground fire, a term that includes most fires, and so ground fires are of many sizes, shapes, and intensities, and practically all man-made fires, such as campfires and fires set to burn slash or brush but allowed to get away at least start as ground fires. The ground fire may become dangerous, even murderous, but most often it's just a lot of hard work to get under control until an hour before the end. That is what the smoke jumpers expected the Man Gulch fire to be: hard work all night, but easing up by morning. The job of controlling most ground fires starts with the job of scraping a fire trench or fire line around it or its flanks so as to force it onto rocks or open meadows. A fire trench or fire line is some 2 to 3 feet wide, is made with a Pulaski and shovel, and is nothing more than a surface of the ground scraped down to mineral soil. Nothing flammable, such as fallen trees or hanging branches, can be left across it. The chief danger from a ground fire is that it will become a crown fire, that is, get into the branches or crowns of trees, especially where the trees are close together and the branches interlace. So a crew has to be careful that a ground fire doesn't burn into a jack pine thicket where the branches are close to the ground and can be set afire by low flames. But there is still a very different way for an ordinary looking fire to explode. A fire doesn't always need flames to advance. A fire may seem under control, burning harmlessly under tall trees with branches too high to be touched by ground flames, but the fire is burning with such intensity that most of the oxygen has been burned out of the air near it, which is heated above the point of ignition. If the wind suddenly changes and fresh air is blown in loaded with oxygen, then the three elements necessary for a fire are suddenly present in the lower branches: flammable material, temperature above the point of ignition, and oxygen. An old-timer knows that when a ground fire explodes into a ground fire with nothing he can see to cause it, he has not witnessed a spontaneous combustion, but the outer appearance of the invisible presence of a fire triangle, suddenly in proper proportions for an explosion. The crown fire is the one that sounds like a train coming too fast around a curve and may get so high-keyed the crew cannot understand what their foreman is trying to do to save them. Sometimes when the timber thins out, it sounds as if the train were clicking across a bridge. Sometimes it hits an open clearing and becomes hushed as if going through a tunnel. But when the burning cones swirl through the air and fall on the other side of the clearing, starting spot fires, the new fire sounds as if it were a train coming out of a tunnel. belching black unburned smoke. The unburned smoke boils up until it reaches oxygen, then bursts into gigantic flames on top of its cloud of smoke in the sky. The new firefighter, seeing black smoke rise from the ground and then at the top of the sky turn into flames, thinks that natural law has been reversed. The flames should come first and the smoke from them. The new firefighter doesn't know how his fire got way up there. He is frightened, and he should be. A fire line, unless a river or a wide right-of-way on a trail is being used as a line, is not much good when a crown fire is off and running. It usually takes a backfire to stop a big crown fire, and the conditions are seldom right for the foreman to start one. He has to build piles of fast-burning twigs, shavings, or dried bunch grass in front of the main fire, and before starting his backfire must wait until the wind blows back toward the main fire, and often it never does. When you fool with a backfire, you are really fooling with fire. You're counting on the wind to continue to blow your backfire toward the main fire. If the wind changes again and blows toward you, your backfire may only have given the main fire a fatal jump on you. It's perhaps even more unpredictable if there isn't much of a wind to begin with, because a big crown fire can make its own wind. The hot, lighter air rises, the cold, heavier air rushes down to replace it in what's called a convection effect, and soon a great fire whirl is started and fills the air with burning cones and branches, which drop in advance of the main fire like the 4th of July and start spot fires. The separate spot fires soon burn together, and life is trapped between the main fire coming from behind and the new line of fire now burning back toward it. Then something terrible can happen. The space between the converged spot fires as they burn close to the main fire can become hotter than the point of ignition. If the convection effect or a change in the wind blows fresh oxygen between the two fires, suddenly replenishing the burned out air, there can be a blow-up, although a blow-up can be caused in still other ways. Not many have seen a blow-up, even fewer have seen one and lived, and fewer have tried afterwards to recover and record out of their seared memories exactly what happened. Later on in Man Gulch, we shall try to recreate a blow-up seen by almost no one who lived to record it, and it might help us preparation if we turn briefly to the great pioneer in the sciences of fire behavior, Harry T. Gisborne, who was one of the first to observe and describe a blow-up accurately. In 1929, Gisborne was on what was up to then Montana's largest man-caused fire, the 90,000-acre Half Moon Fire in Glacier National Park, 640 acres being a section or a square mile. As he says, measured runs show that even a big crown fire advances not much faster than a half a mile an hour. The blow-up that Gisborne witnessed demolished over 2 square miles in possibly 2 minutes, although probably in a minute flat. Returning 2 days later, he found the perfectly balanced body of a young grouse, neck and head, still alertly erect in fear and wonder, the beak, feathers, and feet seared away. Within a few yards was a squirrel stretched out at full length. The burned-off stubs of his little hands were reaching out as far as possible. The back legs were extended full in one final hopeless push, trying, like any human, to crawl just one painful inch further to escape this unnecessary death. Although young men died like squirrels in Man Gulch, the Man Gulch fire should not end there, smoke drifting away and leaving terror without consolation of explanation and controversy without lasting settlement. Probably most catastrophes end this way without an ending, the dead not even knowing how they died, but still alertly erect in fear and wonder. Those who love them forever questioning this unnecessary death, and the rest of us tiring of this inconsolable catastrophe and turning to the next one. This is a catastrophe that we hope will not end where it began. It might go on and become a story. It will not have to be made up. That is all important to us, but we do have to know in what odd places to look for missing parts of a story about wildfire, and of course have to know a story and a wildfire when we see one. So this story is a test of its own belief that in this cockeyed world there are shapes and designs If only we have some curiosity, training, and compassion, and take care not to lie or be sentimental. It would be a start to a story if this catastrophe were found to have circled around out there somewhere until it could return to itself with explanations of its own mysteries and with the grief it left behind, not removed because grief has its own place at or near the end of things, but altered somewhat by the addition of something like wonder. Wonder, for example, because now we can say that the fire whirl which destroyed was caused by three winds on a river. If we could say something like this and be speaking both accurately and somewhat like Shelley when he spoke of clouds and winds, then what we would be talking about would start to change from catastrophe without a filled-in story to what could be called a story of a tragedy, but tragedy would only be a part of it as it is of life.